The vet stepped back, voice shaking, and shouted, "Stop! He's already dead," but the police officer didn't listen. What the officer did next broke every protocol, and saved a life no one thought could be saved. If you believe you've seen it all, this story will prove you wrong. Subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they change how you see courage, instinct, and the thin line between life and death. The night it happened was soaked in rain and sirens, the kind of night that pressed itself into memory whether you wanted it or not, when a German shepherd named Atlas lay motionless on the asphalt outside a closed warehouse on the edge of a forgotten industrial park, his dark fur matted with blood and rainwater as a crowd formed in a half-circle of flashing blue and red lights, and the veterinarian, Drive. Helen Moore, knelt beside him with trembling hands, her breath shallow as she checked his pupils, his gums, his chest, counting seconds that felt like years, while officers whispered behind her and radios crackled with unfinished sentences, because Atlas was not just any dog, he was a decorated K-9 who had served 6 years on the force, tracked missing children through blizzards, cornered armed suspects without ever breaking command, and tonight he had taken a blade meant for his handler during a chaotic chase that ended here, in the rain, and when Dr. Moore finally leaned back, rain streaking down her face like tears she refused to admit to, she said the words that froze everyone where they stood, "Stop. He's already dead," her voice professional but hollow, the kind of voice that comes from someone who has delivered bad news too many times, and a murmur rippled through the officers, some turning away, some staring in disbelief, while Officer Daniel Reyes, Atlas's handler, stood rigid, soaked to the bone, staring at the dog who had slept at the foot of his bed, eaten from his hand, trusted him with absolute loyalty, and Reyes heard the words but refused to accept them, because something in him, a memory, a training session, a half-forgotten lecture from a tactical medicine course no one else bothered to take seriously, was screaming that this was not over yet, and as Dr. Moore reached for a blanket to cover Atlas's body with the quiet finality of someone closing a chapter, Reyes dropped to his knees and said, "Wait," so softly it was almost swallowed by the rain, but then louder, sharper, cutting through the night, "Wait," and Dr. Moore snapped her head up, anger flashing through her grief as she said, "Officer, I've checked him. There's no pulse. Massive blood loss. Neurological response is gone. I'm sorry," and Reyes shook his head, already pulling off his gloves, hands moving with a calm that startled everyone watching, because grief had given way to focus, and he said, "I know what you saw. But let me try something," and another officer grabbed his arm, whispering that he couldn't do this, that protocol was clear, that this was denial talking, but Reyes pulled free, heart pounding, remembering Atlas collapsing mid-run, remembering how his breathing had gone shallow but not stopped, remembering a strange flutter beneath his palm that might have been nothing, or might have been everything, and he placed Atlas onto his side, rain soaking into his uniform as he positioned the dog's head and neck with deliberate care, and Dr. Moore stood frozen, torn between anger and a creeping unease, because she knew Reyes wasn't acting randomly, he was acting with intention, and the crowd fell silent as Reyes placed his hands where Atlas's chest met his ribs, not performing standard CPR, not doing what anyone expected, but applying a technique so obscure that most officers had laughed it off during training, a technique borrowed from battlefield medicine and adapted for K-9 units, one that focused on stimulating the vagus nerve through controlled pressure and timed breathing assistance, and as Reyes began, counting under his breath, matching pressure to rhythm, "Drive." Moore whispered, almost to herself, "That won't work, that can't work," yet she didn't stop him, because something in the air had shifted, something fragile and electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Minutes passed that felt like hours as rain soaked everyone to the skin and the flashing lights painted the scene in surreal colors, and Reyes continued the technique with unwavering focus, ignoring the ache in his arms, the tremor in his hands, the voice in his head telling him this was hopeless, because another voice, quieter but stronger, kept saying not yet, and Dr. Moore watched closely now, professional instincts overriding emotion as she noticed things she hadn't before. The faintest twitch in Atlas's hind leg, so subtle it could have been dismissed as a reflex, the way Reyes adjusted pressure slightly, adapting in real time, recalling details from a training manual he'd read once at 2 in the morning while Atlas slept beside him, and she stepped closer despite herself, heart racing, and said, "What are you doing?" And Reyes replied without looking up, stimulating autonomic response. If there's even a fraction of neural activity left, it can trigger spontaneous respiration, and one of the senior officers scoffed, saying this wasn't a war zone, this was real life, but drive. Moore raised a hand to silence him, because she had just seen Atlas's chest rise, barely, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, and her breath caught as she dropped to her knees beside Reyes, fingers flying to Atlas's throat again, and this time, beneath the rain and the noise, She felt it. Not a strong pulse, not steady, but a flicker, like a dying ember refusing to go out, and she swallowed hard, disbelief crashing into hope as she said, I think there's something, and Reyes looked up at her for the first time, eyes red but burning with fierce determination, and said, then help me, and in that moment protocol shattered completely as vet and officer worked together, drive. Moore tearing open her emergency kit, administering oxygen, applying pressure to the wound with renewed urgency, her earlier certainty dissolving into adrenaline-fueled action, while Reyes continued the technique, adjusting timing as Atlas's breathing stuttered into irregular rhythm, and the officers who had been ready to mourn now stood frozen, watching a miracle unfold inch by inch, because Atlas was fighting, his body responding against all odds, and as the ambulance finally arrived, delayed by the storm and chaos, drive. Moore shouted instructions with a voice that shook not from fear but from awe, because she had declared this dog dead with confidence, and now she was watching him claw his way back, and as Atlas was loaded onto the stretcher, his eyes fluttered open just a fraction, cloudy but aware, and his tail gave the smallest, weakest thump against the metal, a gesture so simple and so powerful that more than one hardened officer turned away to hide tears, and later, in the sterile brightness of the emergency animal hospital, drive. Moore paced the hallway replaying every second in her mind, grappling with the weight of what had happened, because her training, her experience, her certainty had nearly ended a life, and she knew the truth was more complicated than right or wrong. It was about limits, about the dangerous comfort of assumptions, and when the surgeon emerged hours later with exhaustion etched into his face and said, he's alive. Critical, but alive, the room erupted in quiet disbelief, and Reyes sank into a chair, hands shaking as the adrenaline finally released him, whispering Atlas's name like a prayer, unaware that this moment would ripple far beyond this hospital, beyond this city, into conversations, training rooms, and courtrooms where the question would be asked again and again, what happens when one person refuses to accept, already dead? Weeks later, the story had spread across departments, veterinary circles, and media outlets, though details blurred and facts warped as stories often do, but the core remained the same. A vet had called it, an officer had defied it, and a dog had lived, and Dr. Moore sat in a quiet conference room facing a panel reviewing the incident, her voice steady as she admitted her mistake. Not in diagnosis, she clarified, but in finality, explaining that death is not always a single moment but sometimes a fragile process, and Reyes was called to testify too, standing awkwardly in front of microphones as reporters asked how he'd known, how he'd dared to try something so unconventional, and he answered honestly, I didn't know. I just knew I couldn't stop, and the real twist, the one no headline captured, came months later when Atlas walked again, slowly at first, then stronger, with a scar down his side and a limp that never fully disappeared, but with eyes just as sharp and loyalty just as fierce, and when the department announced a new mandatory training module inspired by the incident, incorporating the very technique Reyes had used, drive. Moore was asked to help design it, and she accepted without hesitation, standing beside Reyes during the first session as they taught officers and vets together, united by humility and respect, and in the back of the room, a young recruit raised her hand and asked, how do you know when to stop? And Dr. Moore exchanged a glance with Reyes before answering, you don't always know. That's why you listen, observe, and stay open to being wrong, and Reyes added quietly, and sometimes, you try anyway, and as Atlas lay at Reyes's feet during the session, tail thumping softly against the floor, alive because someone had refused to accept the end, the room fell silent in understanding, because this was no longer just a story about a dog or a technique, it was about the courage to challenge certainty, the humility to learn from mistakes, and the rare, powerful moment when instinct, knowledge, and love collide to rewrite fate itself.